In this video, I'm going to talk all about Vagrant. Towards the end of the video, I'm going to showcase an example Vagrant configuration that I created and that I used to bring up my very own development environments. There will be a link in the description to a GitHub repository containing this configuration that will be freely accessible to anybody who wishes to use it. So, what is Vagrant? Vagrant is a tool that allows you to define properties of a configuration file and run a simple CLI command in order to bring up virtual machines. It reduces a lot of the manual effort involved in creating a virtual machine, as well as configuring it to your needs. Vagrant does all of this within one simple file. I've been using Vagrant for over 2 years now, and I wouldn't go back to any other way of creating virtual machines. It's so simple, so easy to use, and creates consistent environments that can be shared with members of a team. So let's move on to the setup of Vagrant, and let's answer the question, what do you need in order to use Vagrant? Firstly, you'll need a virtualization provider such as VMware, VirtualBox, or others that are out there. For this video, I'm going to be using Parallels Desktop for Mac. Secondly, you'll need to install the Vagrant CLI on the machine from where you'll be launching your virtual machines from. I already have installed Vagrant and I'm using this version of it. Once you're in a position that you have the virtualization provider installed on your machine and the Vagrant CLI, we can then move on to the next section. Next step is to find a Vagrant box that you wish to use. So I'm going to filter based on Parallels, as that's the virtualization provider I'm using, but as you can see at the top here, you can also filter based on VirtualBox or VMware. Next step is to search for the operating system you wish to use. I'm going to use Ubuntu 20.04. And I'm going to select the Bento one, as per the Vagrant documentation. So I'm then going to transition to the terminal, and I'm going to execute the command vagrant box list. And currently I have no boxes installed on this machine, so I'm going to download the one that I've selected. This will take some time. I'll resume the video once it's downloaded fully. Another thing to note is I'll need a plugin installed for Parallels. That can be found here at the Parallels and Vagrant documentation. Once this plugin is installed, we're going to start creating our Vagrant project. So we're going to create a directory from which we're going to initialize our Vagrant project from. For this video, we're going to call it Vagrant Example. Once we're inside the newly created directory, we're going to run the command vagrant init. This will initialize this directory and we'll put some files in here that we'll need. Let's list and see what files have been created. A Vagrant file. We're going to transition to our code editor now and open this file so we can see all of the properties that it provides us. Okay, let's go to our code editor. So now I'm in Visual Studio Code and I have the Vagrant file open. The first thing we'll need to do is set our box, and that will be the box that we downloaded earlier. This is the minimal change that you'll need to make to this file in order to get a virtual machine up and running. So as you can see, within this file there's lots of comments by default, and this clearly explains the different sections that you can set. For example, you can set how much memory the virtual machine needs to have from here. You can also give some scripts or commands that need to be executed when the machine is booted up for the first time or for every time. I'd highly recommend you review the Vagrant documentation, as it provides excellent examples and all of the information surrounding what properties can be set and how they are set. Now I'm going to move on to my example. We'll see that in the next part. So here is my example, Parallels Developer, and this is the Vagrant configuration I use to quickly boot up Vagrant machines with a few extras installed on them. So we're going to go down to the bottom of the file, and just to point out a few interesting things. So I've created provisioners, and provisioners are used in order to install software or run a command every time the Vagrant machine boots up. So for example, let's go to the GitHub one. So in this one, I'll install Git, I'll generate SSH keys for the machine, I'll install the GitHub CLI, and then I'll attach the SSH key to the GitHub account. So whenever the Vagrant machine is booted up, I'll have access via the GitHub CLI to my account. And there's a few others here as well, as in installing Docker, installing AWS, and then just some general stuff in the Bootstrap one. Another interesting thing, since this is a Ruby syntax, you can create methods, Ruby methods, that will execute as the Vagrant file is read. So I have a method here called read that will take a configuration file and will then use those settings that are set in the configuration file as properties, as values for the properties in this file, and that's done there. Okay, and this is the project that will be available on GitHub for you to use, or for some inspiration perhaps. So the next stage is for us to actually load and boot up this virtual machine. In order to start a virtual machine or to create it for the first time, we'll need to go to the CLI, and the command is vagrant up, as simple as that. So the first time we run this command, it will take between 3 to 5 minutes to complete. After that, it should only take a couple of minutes, maybe even less. So once this virtual machine has been fully created with all the provisioners run, we'll resume the video and we'll connect to it so you can see that. Okay, so the vagrant up command finished executing. I'm going to provide another video after this one that will detail an alternate way in which you can connect to the virtual machine we just created, and the one that I generally tend to use as well. But for this one, we're just going to use the simple vagrant SSH command in order to connect to our virtual machine. So we're going to make the terminal slightly bigger. Okay, so as you can see, we have SSH'd into our newly created virtual machine, and I commented a couple of the provisioners out since I didn't want the creation time to be too lengthy, and instead we just ran the Bootstrap provisioner and the Docker one. So we can see from here we have an IP address for our Docker installation, but to double check, and that command returned back this. So as you can see, through setting the values of a few properties in the Vagrant file, as well as creating a couple of provisioner scripts, I'm able to create as many virtual machines as I want with Docker installed, and no extra manual effort is required. So now we're going to disconnect from our virtual machine, we're going to stop our virtual machine, which for all intents and purposes is the equivalent of shutting down our operating system. And that's it. We have now shut down our virtual machine. I'm going to transition to my virtualization provider Parallels, just so you can see that a virtual machine was created with the name Parallels Developer. So that's all for this video. To recap, we spoke about Vagrant, what it is, how it can be of benefit to us, and we went for an example of how to actually create a virtual machine as well. And like I said at the start of this video, there'll be a link to this specific configuration on my GitHub page that's accessible to anyone who wants to clone it in order to use that as a starting point to create some virtual machines. In the follow-up video, I'll show you how, as a developer, I use this development environment and connect to it through Visual Studio Code, and how I tend to work when I'm working on a software project. So thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.